There are many people today who question the relevance of the Old Testament. Do we really need it when we have the New Testament and the revelation of Jesus? After all, doesn't Jesus just replace the Old Testament? And there have been many through the centuries that have tried to make versions of the Bible without an Old Testament. So what relevance does it have today? For us today, this is the Sermon on the Mount and fulfillment. As Jesus cites the law and the prophets, he says a really interesting phrase. He says that he hasn't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The word he uses here is pleroo, and we usually translate it as fulfill. Now, this fulfillment idea is already well saturated in the book of Matthew. The narrative context of the book of Matthew has been using this word pleroo a lot. In fact, in the first 2 chapters alone, there are 5 fulfillment quotations that say this was done in order to fulfill the words of the prophets. And we see Matthew quoting Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Hosea, all in this idea of Jesus is fulfilling what has been said by these prophets. And now we have to be really careful here. This word pleroo doesn't mean fulfillment like we in the modern Western world would think about it. We tend to think of fulfillment as a prediction was made and that prediction has now happened. I really want to warn you against that being your view of what is happening here. Because that isn't really how fulfillment works in the biblical worldview. Yes, there is some of that, but it's kind of a subset. And fulfillment itself is something bigger than simply predictions coming true. And it has to do with this idea that we talked about yesterday of the law being a foundational story that's reinterpreted again and again. You see, what gets quoted by Matthew as fulfillment often isn't predictions. A good example is the quote from Hosea in chapter 2, "Out of Egypt I brought my son." That quote in Hosea 11 has nothing to do with the Messiah. It's God lamenting over how he rescued Israel in the Exodus. And here is Matthew saying, Jesus matches this. See, what you want to see here is this idea of the story that was, the foundational story of Israel, is happening again. So there's this idea in fulfillment that foundational identifying story happens over and over. Events that are in the foundational story, events that are in the prophets reinterpreting, point towards the story happening again. They kind of figuratively connect to one another along the way. And so Matthew in his gospel actually takes quite a bit of time to establish Jesus as a new Moses. And he actually takes some time, as you saw in that Hosea quote, to actually establish Jesus kind of as the people of Israel in rescue, in redemption. See, in many ways, when Jesus says he's come to fulfill, what he's saying is that story of redemption you have seen in the law, that story of redemption you have seen played out in the prophets, and the redemption the prophets promised would come, it is here. The story is happening again. All those previous stories of God redeeming the people in the Exodus, of God restoring his people time and time again in the Judges, of God restoring his people from exile, are all pointers, all hints of a story that is to come. They're like preview editions, draft copies almost, that point to what the final edition of the book will have. It's probably worth remembering this. Fulfillment can only affirm Torah, not cast doubt on it. Fulfillment can only take the story that has been and replay it out in a new way, in a new setting. The story of God who redeems, who saves. This is what fulfillment is. That story of God at work is playing itself out again. This is what it pointed to. Redemption happening once more. Oh, so beautifully. Oh, so gloriously. Jesus didn't come with a plan B. We tried plan A in the Old Testament. That didn't work. God's personality didn't change. The God of the Old Testament is mean and angry. The God of the New Testament is kind and loving. That's not the case. It's never been the case. Because if Jesus is to fulfill Torah, he lives Torah, he repeats Torah. He gives that foundational story of redemption, a new lease of life in his work. It's pointing towards him and what he has come to do so that we understand what he has come to do. There is no plan B. This is plan A. This is how God works, and we've seen his redemption at work over and over again every time we've needed it as his people. This is fulfillment. God is redeeming once again.